So Miriam Juan-Torres, who is our next speaker here on stage, is the head of research of OBI's Democracy and Belonging Forum, and she looked exactly into those tactics and strategies of anti-democratic movements ranging from Turkey to Texas. So please welcome with me Miriam Juan-Torres.
Hi, everyone. Hola. We may be having a little technical issues, so they'll tell me if we have the presentation or not. Does it always have to happen to me? I don't know. I think we could change at some point. Should I come down or? There we go. Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. I told my team, great, I'm right after lunch, right after John and Eche, right after this performance, so I'm not sure how I'm going to be doing this. And I'm going to ground us and shift a little bit and get us to what it is the phenomena we're talking about, and then what are the strategies and tactics that are being utilized to further othering. And knowing when I was starting, I thought, how do I start this? And I thought, well, those who know me know that I love food. So I'm going to talk about food for a moment. And I don't know how this works either. The big one. There we go. OK, so I cannot see everyone, but who here has been to Spain? OK, all right. Anyone here struggles with meal times in Spain? OK, a bunch. So meal times are one of the most divisive issues in my family. You have my dad and me on one camp, and then my brothers. And I've been allowed to say, moltes felicitats, Papa. It's his birthday, so, and he's watching. He doesn't speak English, but I thought I'd try. And my brother's on another camp. And I'm a researcher, so I always go to the data, and I'm like, I'm going to stick it to my brothers. I know I'm right. So I want to look into the meal times. And the thing is that Spain is in the wrong time zone. And why is Spain in the wrong time zone? Well, during fascist times, dictator Francisco Franco wanted to be on the same time zone as Mussolini and Hitler. So he thought, well, I'll just change the timeline in Spain. Spain should be aligned with Portugal and with the UK, but it's actually on the same time zone as Germany and Italy. And nobody has changed it. But I think this anecdote is it embodies the fact that even though we think of nationalism and nativism as inherently national and rooted in the nation, and maybe an nationalist, internationalist in a contradiction in terms, fascist authoritarians have collaborated since probably times immemorial, but at least definitely in the 20th century. And this was not just something that happened in Europe, but also across the pond. So Mussolini, for example, in 1933 started in an American biopic by Columbia Pictures, where he was presented as the voice that America needs. And Mussolini, even though he was Italian, was one of the first authoritarians outside of the States to speak in English to American audiences. He also had a syndicated column in the United States. So we know that some cross-fertilization has happened for decades. And obviously, this is something that's been gathering a lot of attention in recent years as well. This is a picture from a few years ago, and we have Geert Wilders from the Netherlands, Matteo Salvini from Italy, and Marine Le Pen from France as well. So the leaders and how they work have been getting a lot of attention. We often, or sometimes we hear how we call them fascists, or populists, or right-wing, or in a variety of terms. So what I'm going to try to do today is actually situate us. Like, how is this phenomenon, what does this look like today? Is it different from what it used to look like? In what ways, what tactics and strategies? And then, what is the infrastructure of cooperating? And in the words of Steve Bannon, a great strategist, even though an evil mind, is there such a thing as a populist infrastructure, as he was trying to build, or are we confronting something else? And the reason I think these two things are important is because, on the one hand, in order to confront this phenomenon, but also build something different, we need to really understand what it is that we're facing. But then also, if we see how they cooperate, what are the strategies and the tactics, we can also develop our strategies as well. And we will not create these societies that we were talking about earlier as well, societies of belonging, if we don't strategize and respond and co-create in an active manner. The one thing that I wanted to preface us by saying as well is that we tend to talk about far-right movements or authoritarian populists, authoritarians, fascists. And it is the leaders oftentimes that we think about, or at least that's me, definitely in the media. They're the ones that get more attention, understandably. And we have Victor Orbán here, Santiago Abascal from Spain. But we can be talking about the leaders of the far right, of authoritarian populism. But we also know that there are movements, and these can be political organizations. There's a range of think tanks. It can be media conglomerates that fit and are part of this. And we also have subcultures. And I'm going to touch a little bit about that because we were talking about meaning makers and culture makers. And it's not just the leaders that make meaning, it's also the movements, the cultures, the aesthetics, the fashion, and so on. So I'm going to be referring about that as well, but I think I want us to try to keep that in mind, that we can be talking about this loosely said, like 3 levels, although of course it's blurred and they feed off each other, and it's all part of a one. And this is an example of one of the platforms that they use. And this is just a screenshot of one of the days that I went into Gap, which is one of the social platforms that far-right movements utilize. And I decided to pick this one because the far-right content is the first thing that comes up, but also I thought it was interesting to see how a lot of these things don't necessarily relate to politics, and there's like many avenues and gateways to these movements and this culture. So I entered this page from Spain, but it led me here directly, and we know that they go into classic cards, American-made, handmade market, aesthetics, cooking, but then in between all of these, peppered in it, you also have, well, Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee, and going after the trans community and alternative gender models. So that's just to kind of like reinforce this idea that we do see these at different layers. Even though I'm going to be talking about the leaders, the movements, and the subcultures, it's also true that the vast majority of people, even if we think about the voters, or the vast majority of voters of far-right leaders or authoritarian populists, are actually not part of the movements, they're not part of the subcultures, they're not directly in contact with the leaders. But it is true as well that their ideas have become, the voters have become more receptive to these ideas. So the question is why, and I think that John touched onto this already, so I'm not gonna get into that, but I think it's important to maintain that awareness that that's not most of them that are part of this, but the movements, the leaders, and then the subcultures are the most vocal, they're the meaning makers, they're the ones shaping public discourse. And then oftentimes when we think about electoral politics, and because that's an important realm as well, oftentimes we need to think about a polarized landscape or fragmentation, because the vote often is more a vote against, and that's why the stories that they make are important, and not necessarily a vote for. So going into how are they different from the previous movements. So if we think about fascism, and I'm sorry if there's any political theorists in the room, I'm really sorry for what I'll do during the next 20 minutes. And then if you're not a political theorist, this might bother you as well, because you might be using some of that language, but I am a social scientist, so I'll go into this anyways. If we think about fascist movements, oftentimes we think about a mode of governance of the interwar period. In fascist movements and in a fascist state, the power rests mostly on a leader, and this leader embodies the nation and the state. So it's less about a movement, it's about the leader himself. The state is an ethical, spiritual entity. And if we think about Russia and Putin, for example, and how I differentiate it from the movements that we see, whether it's Trump or Orbán or so on, they're not populist, and I'll get into that later. But they're not as populist because they don't say that they speak for the people, the state, the nation. They embody the state and the nation. They are not necessarily saying that I'm speaking for, I'm not the voice of the people, or they're not advocating for democracy. but it's the state, the nation, the purity of Russia or of the Italy at the time that they're actually for. And the economy was in fascist times also organized in a very structured way. So my family, my parents, and my grandparents particularly grew up in a dictatorship. Everything has a role allocated. And it can have variances, obviously, but it's a different economic model as well versus what we're seeing today of like the neoliberalist model with some state control. And we could get into that. I'm happy to answer questions later on if you want to catch me. But there are differences between what we were experiencing in the past and what we experience today economically as well. And it also is different, at least rhetorically or at the narrative level, and I think this is important when it comes to racial hierarchies. Because there was an openness and explicitness at the time where they were building racial hierarchies saying that there are some races that are superior to others. And they were saying these races are based on biological truths. Whereas nowadays, the far-right movements that we see, the authoritarian populisms, tend to refer to something called ethnopluralism. So all races are equal, but we need to keep them pure and separate, and to each their own. This is a different line of argument, and this is an argument that maybe will resonate with more voters than if you are having explicitly supremacist arguments. I'm not saying those do not exist, they do definitely exist, but at the narrative level, in the democracies where we see a rise of the far right, the argument is different. And I should have specified as well, I'm not talking about the autocratic societies, but I'm focusing mostly on Europe and North America, although India and Brazil would also fit into these categories. In fascist states, there were no elections, and there was a total takeover of the state. Current authoritarian populists, they're also different from contemporary autocrats. The lines are more blurred. There's definitely cooperation, but it's also a little bit different as well. There's a writer called Anne Applebaum that some of you might be familiar with, and she talks about autocracy incorporated. And she talks about autocrats in modern times, whether it's Putin, Xi Jinping, but also Maduro, and others. We can also think of societies like Saudi Arabia, which actually don't have a common ideology. They have a very different vision for their own countries. They don't have the same values, but they have common interests. And they all advocate against democracies, they take action against it, and they also claim or are against human rights, often in a very open way, and sometimes deploying decolonial arguments and language against human rights and against democracy as well. Thus weaponizing some of the language narratives that have been developed in post-colonial movements against human rights, democracy, and against their people. As I was mentioning earlier, current autocrats tend not to be populist, and we can make some distinctions here because Venezuela, for example, is a place that has had a little bit of a different journey. But as I was saying, I don't think Xi Jinping will be saying that I actually want a democracy and I'm actually the voice of the people and I'm challenging the will of the nation. And that's different as well because the populists we see in Europe, in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, for example, are not using the same rhetoric, the same narratives, nor the same attempts when it comes to Hungary or Poland to unravel democracies as they are doing in some other places. But they do learn from each other, and there's a lot of collaboration. So I want to underscore that the lines are blurred. Autocrats share tactics, and it is true that when it comes to authoritarian populists, they do share tactics as well. So I keep saying authoritarian populism, so what do I mean by that? Authoritarian populism, to me, is the most accurate way, and I'm sure there's people here who will fight me in terms of like the language that I'm using. But I do think it's accurate because it does combine the authoritarianism, the populism, and the nativism. So when we talk about populism, I like to follow the description of a scholar called Cas Mudde that defines it as a thin-centered ideology. What does that mean? It has some ideological components, but it's not truly something that has a lot of substance. It's usually attached to something else, but it's dividing society into two groups: the people versus the elites, the morally corrupt elite against the people that the authoritarian populist speaks for. And they use democratic purposes or elections to get into power. They channel that voice that they say they have. And populists can take different forms. There's also left-wing populism, there's libertarian populism, but there's also authoritarian populism. That's the one that I'm talking about. Because it overlays with the us versus them, with defining an us against which we construct who we are, and defining a them against which we contrast who we are, and that them is often marginalized communities, migrants, it could be other communities that are part of the nation. But there's that overlay between us and them in this phenomenon, and the us versus them axis, and then the people versus elite axis that we're talking about. And then there's the nativism or nationalism. They see the nation as a pure entity, the unity of which needs to be maintained. And there's this concoction of elements that shapes the current movements of the far right that we're seeing that I've been calling authoritarian populism. They promote an ideology of majoritarianism. So in some places, if they build a racial argument, for example, or if we can think of Orbán, and I will provide a few examples now, they actually defend majoritarianism and they can benefit from elections. They will tamper with elections. They will control the media. They will control the judiciary or try to, but there's still an openness. There's still elections. We just saw the results in Poland. Despite all of the attempts, it seems that the political situation might be shifting. So there's room for maneuver in a way that maybe we don't see in Russia, or we don't see in Saudi Arabia, or the UAE, or Venezuela. But they speak of this majoritarianism, and they can weaponize people's emotions and sentiments, and we've said before. They reject multiculturalism and minority rights. They have an essentialist or nativist view of the nation, and sometimes, and the next panel will tackle gender, so I will not get into it, they also build arguments about traditional views of gender and the role of men and women, the complementarity between the sexes. But, and I put the asterisk here for a particular reason, which is sometimes, particularly we see that in Western Europe, they will deploy gender as convenient to build a racialized nation. So if saying that I defend the rights of the LGBT community because Muslims are going to take them away from me, if that's convenient in France to the Front National, Rassemblement National now, or if it's convenient for Alternative for Deutschland, they might actually appropriate women's rights, or they might appropriate LGBT rights. So we need to be in understanding of these different ways in which othering of particular communities is going to be deployed. Orbán, for example, has been incredibly open about the fact that he rejects liberal democracy, a democracy where minorities have rights, where there's certain diversity, where everyone can belong. And so he's made a speech, I think this was 2014, where he said, what I'm for is Christian democracy, also illiberal democracy, and it is not liberal, and I acknowledge it openly, because a liberal democracy is one that respects multiculturalism, whereas we prioritize a Christian democracy, what is known, the nostalgia, our past, even if it's not true as it was being said earlier, but that's what he says he promotes. And a liberal democracy is pro-immigration, whereas a Christian or illiberal democracy is anti-immigration. And a liberal democracy sides with adaptable family models, and illiberal defends the Christian family, what you know, what you live, what you experience, and he makes very emotional, compelling arguments in favor of this. And so this is the model that they're building, but this is also the model, the language, the rhetoric that they're copying from each other. Because even though it may seem, as I was saying earlier, that the cooperation between very nativist leaders, movements, subcultures is difficult, when you build a project around racialized societies, for example, it can be transnational because it's about whiteness. And similarly, it can be around ideology. And there are shared stories. There's common trends and patterns, there's shared storytellings. And othering is the underlying mechanic of it. I was mentioning storytelling because it's come up a lot, the meaning makers, but the stories that are being told in each of the nations are quite similar. We can think about the Great Replacement theory, which was born in France, but has been deployed across Europe, in the United States. But it doesn't even need to be necessarily a white supremacy project, like we see the leader of Tunisia using Great Replacement theory against sub-Saharan Africa. We see Modi also using a lot of discourse around the supremacy of Hindus against the Muslim communities. There's similar storytellings, the actors, the people against this is deployed might change, but the stories are similar. And the causes that are adopted as well. Because if they identify that transphobia is actually something that can activate people's fears and emotions, they'll deploy it and try it across the board. And sometimes it will not work, but they will try it. And if something sticks, they will keep using it. And we do see that. But at the same time, it is also true that this is quite localized as well in the way in which it is deployed. And again, this is where I was mentioning gender, and gender is fascinating. We do a lot of work on it. But we do see those differences when it comes to how LGBT rights are deployed by authoritarian populists in different places. So how does this cooperation? Is there really an infrastructure? It happens at different levels. I structure it in 3 ways, but it's actually quite arbitrary. And as I was mentioning, the lines are blurred. But there's personal connections, there's infrastructure at the narrative and policy level, and then there's also style and culture. So personal connections are important. I think this has come up also earlier on. We're doing this in community. We're more than 300 people, I think, here today. We can connect, and like those connections we make here are important, but a lot of them are connected as well. So Giorgia Meloni, she's one of my obsessions, has been one of the guests at the Conservative Political Action Conference in the United States. It's one of the largest conservative conferences in the US. She's been a guest of honor. She was really cheered on. So has Orban been a guest. We also know that some of the people that work at the think tanks have been hanging out quite a lot in Hungary as well to actually learn about the strategies, the tactics, and how to deploy that, and how to leverage state power. Connections are also sometimes strong with autocrats. We see Putin and Berlusconi here. Obviously, this is from a few years ago. They're both much younger, but their relationship had almost a romantic quality to it. They used to spend a lot of New Year's together. I assume this is somewhere in the Mediterranean. Doesn't look like Russia to me, but maybe I'm wrong. We know that, for example, there was some turmoil last week or 2 weeks ago because Viktor Orban was spending some time with Putin. And because these things are complicated, the US condemned it and the Europeans did not. But the personal connections exist. Are they enough to create change to the level that we're seeing? No, but they are important and we need to understand that. There's also sporadic events and international fora in which people from the movements gather. Sometimes it's the leaders, but oftentimes it's people in the movements as well. And we do see that particularly at a sectoral level. For example, this is the World Congress of Families. This was the 2022 gathering. It's a gathering, the last one, 2022 took place in Mexico. It brought up people, it gathered people from across the world. And I don't know who are the Spaniards in the room, but I picked this picture for them because this lady here with the iPhone is a very famous aristocrat, an influencer in Spain. And I think this speaks to the reality that influencer, culture makers, social media are also deployed for these projects. And so they brought her. There was a lot of backlash against her on social media because she spoke in favor of heterosexual marriage, and icons are made by a lot of gays in Spain and elsewhere probably. And people were pissed off, but that generated discourse, that generated backlash, but that also elevated these ideas. It put them in the mainstream, and they do work with the influencers to bring them to the stage and amplify their ideas. And then there's the infrastructure. There's not really a centralized powers of authoritarian populists, whether we think about the leaders, whether we think about the movements or the subcultures. Bannon wanted to create that populist infrastructure a few years ago, and I think there was a lot of media around it, and he failed massively. That does not exist. A lot of the coordination efforts have failed, and then we have seen things like the Institute of Social, Economic, and Political Sciences, which is actually kind of like a summer school created by Marion Maréchal, who's a member of the Le Pen family, to actually train authoritarian populist leaders or far-right leaders and to develop conservative thinking, especially in Europe. It seems that it's been quite a failed effort, but they do exist. Others have tried a franchise model, so the English Defence Leagues have existed for many, many years in the UK. They're social movements. Some have tried to replicate it in other countries across the world. But there's no such thing as a solid infrastructure for exchanging tactics and strategies. That being said, as I was mentioning, they will speak in the next panel about this. When it comes to, for example, the anti-gender campaigns, things seem to be more solid, and there are other spaces as well in which this is happening. And social media acts as a portable propaganda device that facilitates the spread of the subcultures and the exchange. And that's also why culture, style, and so on are so important, because that's the gateway for many people into these movements, even if they're just looking at, searching for how to make an apple pie. And I'll get to that, so hold me to it. There's a lot of mimicry, emulation, and authoritarian learning, as we say, though. And I'm going to get into that. There's also shared best practices and funding streams. So as we say, chase the money, because the money will reveal a lot as well. And we know that there's global funding funnels for these efforts. When it comes to the strategies and tactics, we can see that emulation and mimicry at the policy level, and that's particularly focused on eroding democratic institutions and the infrastructure. At the Democracy and Belonging Forum, we think a lot about what it means to talk about democracy. And I think when we were naming the program, we discussed a lot about whether to use the word democracy or not. And there's a variety of reasons, but we know that a lot of the democracies in which we live have many, many flaws and are failing a lot of people. There's state-sanctioned violence, there's corruption, they're rife with problems. And I don't want to minimize that. At the same time, the project of authoritarian populists today is partially to dismantle the protections and institutions that exist. So not to better them, but not to do away with them entirely. It's not about marching and doing a coup d'etat and getting into power and establishing a totalitarian state. It's about reshaping and remodeling it. And a few years ago, far-right movements in Europe tended to be pro-Brexit or Grexit or Italexit, and we added exit to all of the country names. But that's shaping as well, because the strategy now is don't do away with the EU, capture it and reshape it. And we do see that in a lot of the policies and that are developing as well, which is keep a legal facade, but manipulate them. There's also narratives and public discourse that's deployed, the meaning-making that we were talking, and the style and culture. And there's this idea of leveraging state power. And I put it here at the bottom because that's something that's been shifting, and it's different in the US from what it is in Europe. So in Europe, generally, there's been a more interventionist state, or there's been a welfare system. A lot of citizens are more used to the state having a stronger presence. Conservatives in Europe, and I know there are differences, but conservatives usually have advocated for low taxes or a particular small model of the state, but not in the same way as in the United States, where it was a more minimal conception of the role of the state. But that's shifting as well in far-right movements and amongst a lot of leaders of the Trumpian world and the far-right world in the US. There's a movement toward considering how state power can be leveraged. So instead of having the same kind of minimal state that they used to advocate for before, actually using state to push for a particular model of a nation. And we do see this kind of thinking coming out of a lot of the think tanks in the US that are part of the far right. So that was just a mention that I wanted to make. When it comes to slow erosion of democratic institutions, they're doing it in a variety of realms. So when it comes to, and I mention examples from different places because I think it's important to keep an eye on what others are doing, because that might give you an idea of what's coming to your country. So constitutional reforms have been used particularly in, for example, Hungary. And this is where the second term is incredibly important, because a lot of these tend to be enacted in the second term. Reducing the independence of the judiciary, controlling state media or manipulating it, and going against journalists, the shrinking and targeting of civil society. And I think that also touches on a lot of the people who are in this room. We see how that happens through different strategies, but also how they're quickly copying each other. Russia has been a model for a lot of the targeting of organizations that work on gender and women's rights. When it comes to migration, for example, we see how the Italian government is really targeting organizations that do search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean to avoid the rescues of migrants. But we also see, for example, how international funding is being utilized or going after NGOs that use international funding and banning that international funding is a strategy that's been deployed in India, in Hungary, and that leaders are going and are trying to use this kind of policy against international funding of NGOs. Education is also a realm where they are mimicking each other. So I think it was last year that Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida made a lot of headlines because of the Stop Woke Act. And this is one of the smart things that they do as well with language and the causes that they advocate transnationally, which was stop wronging our kids and employees. So Stop Woke Act, or the Don't Say Gay Act as well. So using what can be taught in public schools, on the one hand as a policy, but also to create a lot of drama and discourse around it, and so on. The narrative and public discourse, this is where they are very, very effective. And the strategy is not necessarily to make sure that everyone agrees, but actually to set the terms of the discussion. So set the agenda. They have a few topics at which they excel. For example, migration, or now the trans issue, at activating and creating a lot of discourse and ridiculizing. So push the agenda, make sure that these are the topics that are mostly being debated. And the success that they've had has been on actually making sure that those topics are at the center of public discourse, but then also mainstreaming a lot of their ideas and detaching them from themselves in a way that a lot of the far-right ideas have now become part of the mainstream. And language and policies are being debated amongst center-left, center-right, and being used as forgetting where they originated, but just becoming part of what's normalized. And then there's also an intellectual infrastructure. I'm being told that I need to wrap up as well, so I'm gonna keep it short now. But we also know that they are mimicking and emulating each other when it comes to style and culture. So a lot of our complaints are around the blatant lies that they use. There's this book called Populocracy by Catherine Fieschi that I really love, because she unpacks why lies work so much for authoritarian populists. Because the lying and transgression is actually a way of showing authenticity and a way of showing that actually I'm gonna go the extra mile for you. You are my people, I'm speaking for you, and if I need to lie for you, I'll go there and I'll say some crazy shit and you'll see me doing this. And then I'll go with, and this is quite gender as well, but for the men, right? Like Boris Johnson, privately educated in the fanciest schools in the UK, but I'll just be disheveled and with my crazy hair and the tie, no tie, and because I'm one of you. Then we see that the far-right female leaders have a very different kind of style and are very polished. So there's gender dynamics into the style as well. But that happens. We also see how far-right movements have been adopting a new cultural strategy and actually copying a lot from grassroots organizing. So trying to develop a presence in schools, amongst unions, and adopting an idea that in order to change politics and in order to change society, you need to change culture first, which used to be Gramscian Italian thinking and now has been adopted by the far-right as well. And then developing hip and cool subcultures and aesthetics that people can belong to. And then creating a sense for belonging for people who, because of the changes, because of the fear and so on, feel more unsettled. And there's many portals into this. Humor is one of them, and the meme culture is huge in terms of how these ideas spread. So we do see it across the board. We've all come across memes, but the cultures online are really, really incredible when it comes to doing some fun stuff. They're funny, you laugh. Humor is also transgressive, and thus, in a moment of uncertainty, when you don't know what to believe anymore, when you see something transgressive, it does seem a little bit more real. But then developing other kinds of cultures, niche cultures, that don't attract a lot of people, but through aesthetics cover the ideology that's behind. So this is one that's quite niche, but I'm also quite obsessed with. It's called #TradWives. I don't know who is familiar with this. It's a reappraisal of 1950s aesthetic and ways of being and of understanding gender. They're quite big on Instagram and on TikTok, so they don't talk a lot about politics, but there's a lot of politics behind. It's covered behind aesthetic. One of the most famous one, and I'm sorry, Sarah, I know I'm over time, but I love the Trot Wives. I really don't, but it's fascinating. One of them is called Gwen the Milkmaid Woman, and she's an icon of the Trot Wives. She used to be a far-left YouTuber who was also quite active on OnlyFans. But she ended up as an icon of the Trot Wives. And I speak about this because some of these subcultures are portals into the movements. And we do see what Naomi, I learned this from Naomi Klein, who's been mentioned several times today, but they call it diagonalism. They're people who feel disenfranchised, frustrated, oftentimes rightly so, and go on a journey to the far right. So I'm going to wrap up with this. I felt maybe thinking about the inferences of what to do about it, it was a good way to end, but it also felt quite arrogant to do so, because obviously the people in the room have far more knowledge than I do in terms of what to do about it, and there's such a plethora of activism here. But I did think that from everything that we've been learning at the forum, there's a few things that we need to keep in mind. This idea of understanding and looking at each other, having that comparative perspective and collaborating globally, but also obviously keeping that reminder that these things then are translated into local context. Following the money, awareness of how division is weaponized, because division is very actively weaponized. And we see that whenever there is a situation that they manage to put in the agenda, and then like for activists, amongst progressive movements, they do try to stoke division and breaking amongst us. So keeping that awareness, but also building the long bridges is as well. Also knowing that there are differences between the leaders, but then the movements and the subcultures, and being able to also keep some openness to the empathy and not fall for the dehumanization, because then we're just building their project as well. Not ceding territory as well, and abandoning the ideas. And I think they've talked a lot about joy, so I'm not going to get into that. And then helping promote an alternative vision that people can get excited about. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.